Hey, welcome back. Tonight we're talking about building employee training programs. Training is one of the things that there's a lot of arguments over on the internet, especially if you look at people looking for new jobs and they're wondering why companies don't train anymore. I think that's untrue. I think a lot of companies do invest in training in their employees, but many struggle to find the balance between, how much should a person be doing outside of work to better themselves if they want a promotion versus how much on the job training should be given to improve people. Um, you know, some companies get worried about sponsoring employees or paying for them to take expensive trainings, right? Going to a course that might cost several $1,000s to attend the training, $1,000 or so for the exam. Those aren't insignificant amounts of money, especially when you have more than a couple of employees. And they feel like maybe if they do that stuff, these employees might just become the targets of poaching, that they're just going to get hired off by a bigger, badder company, and that investment kind of goes out the window. And it's hard to find that balance. It really is. I mean, we want to invest in our employees. We want them to be the best they can be, but we want to protect that investment and make sure we get the ROI associated with it, right? And I think Richard Branson's quote here is probably the best answer to that, right? It's train people well enough so they can leave, treat them well enough so they don't want to. And I think that's the key. So if you're watching this video, hopefully you already are on board with the idea that employees need to be trained, and part of that is your responsibility as a manager and as a company. So let's dive into how we can develop some training plans that make sense. So first up, you're going to have one plan, but it's going to have at least two parts, right? This plan needs to work for people you're bringing into the company as a new hire. They require a certain level of training to convert the knowledge that you hired them with and make it so they can apply that knowledge within your business. And then you need long-term plans for all your team. Um, we're going to talk a little bit today about the components of the plans, different kinds of trainings and things like that. But really, when you think about this, think about building a training plan that you rebuild and revamp every year with each employee to get them moving along. And then make sure there's that component of it that you handle for new hires, because you should be thinking about this as you onboard people. People should start training right away, whether it's in-house training, whether it's tool training, whether it's something technical that they just need to keep up on that you really focus on internally, whether it's training to set a baseline for the rest of the team so that new hire has all those little gaps filled in that maybe they didn't pick up in their previous experience. But understand that you need a training program that's for everybody and then also has the capability to be adjusted for new hires. New hire trainings really should include things like introducing them to your company, right? We're not talking just technical stuff. We're talking about process, procedure. You want to get them proficient with your tool stack. If we're hiring technical people, it's possible they know how to do lots of stuff, just not with the tools you use, right? There's a billion different kind of vulnerability management tools. There's different ticketing systems. There's different firewalls. And, somebody who knows how to manage a network probably knows how to configure routers, switches, and firewalls, but maybe they don't know your kind of firewall. So giving them some introductory training to those types of things, interfaces, things like that, super important as new hires. But really, you have to focus on bringing them into your culture, making them comfortable, making them aware of how the company itself operates, how the people interact with each other. That's all really critical stuff you need to have for the new hire side of things. And then for current employees, really, we're thinking about improving their current performance, right? We want to make them better at their job ultimately. And we also want to prepare them for the next role. If we're thinking employee retention, if we're thinking employee growth, if we're trying to scale our company, we need to make sure that people are ready to move with us. And we want to encourage their passion. Don't forget that people will inherently work harder at the things they love. So make sure that your training isn't just focusing on the parts of their jobs they don't like, because we all have those parts, right? Like, hopefully our jobs are like 50% things we love, 30% maybe things we tolerate, and 20% things we probably just dislike genuinely. Make sure the training focuses on the parts that they love to keep them motivated, keep them moving forward. If they're bad at the 20% they hate, help them get some training there so they hate it less probably. But really make sure some of that training is towards the thing that people that got them into this space to begin with, really. So let's talk about what goes into these plans. Your plan needs to have a bunch of different components, right? It's not just technical training. And I think this is where a lot of MSPs kind of fall short sometimes. We're really good at getting people training on the tools we use typically. Vendors provide a lot of that stuff. So it's easy to say, hey, go here, watch these videos on how our RMM works. Hey, go watch this video on ConnectWise University. We know it's boring. Go watch it anyway, because boy, those videos are boring. But we also focus on things like technical stuff, like, hey, go take this Microsoft cert. Like, we're okay at that stuff. We understand how technical training works. We understand how vendor training works. Where we fall short sometimes are things like soft skills. So make sure you're including those in your training. Coming up as an engineer, I remember always getting reviews for almost my entire career that said, Jordan is really technically proficient, does a great job, works well with customers, all that stuff. Jordan is often very, very blunt. Jordan, his tone is sometimes, harsh. It's this, it's that. And every year on my review, I'd say, great. Is there some kind of training you could recommend to help me be better at that? Because I've taken lots of certs. I have a bunch of them, right? Like I went to a lot of training to learn the technical stuff, but my company never really helped me understand how to be a better communicator. They didn't really help me be better at the soft skills, and that was unfortunate. Um, Eventually, I figured it out that I needed to figure that out, and they were supportive of it. And I went and found some books and I practiced things, but I would have been a lot better if maybe 5 years earlier somebody would have helped me out with that and really made me focus on soft skills versus the technical stuff. I grew quickly in my technical capability, but my soft skills fell behind, and that really stunted my growth overall for years. So focus on that stuff. And don't forget to teach people about business fundamentals. Again, this is one businesses shy away from, right? We don't really want to talk about money with a lot of our employees sometimes, out of fear, usually for the owners, right? They don't want employees to get the feeling that maybe the owner's making too much, or they don't want to get into those discussions that maybe the company's not doing so well, and you don't want to, scare your employees. Some owners think it's just not their business, right? But ultimately, if you educate your team on how the business functions, how decisions are made, you empower them to both talk to you about problems in a way that you can communicate that aren't just technical, but also talk to your customers that way. And that's a big differentiator in the MSP space, right? If an engineer can speak the language of business to your point of contacts, to your decision makers, that's a lot more helpful than if they just show up saying, "Hey, we need to replace disks in a RAID." Ultimately, we need them to be able to communicate with businesses. So teach them about businesses. How do businesses make decisions? That kind of stuff becomes really, really important. And you can dive super deep on that kind of stuff. Teach them the basics of accounting, teach them how businesses budget. All that stuff comes into play, and it makes your life easier long term. When we're coming up with our training plans, there's three basic kinds of training, right, that we should incorporate. Good training plans incorporate all of these things. They all have pros and cons. We'll talk about them each, but they're on the job training, right? That's training you do in your company, right? You're doing the training, and engineers doing the training. It's people you work with training each other. We have formal third-party training. This is where we send someone to a training. It might be online, it might be in person, it might be self-paced, it might be live online. There's a bunch of different varieties of this, but these are where we get like our certifications and things like that. And then peer engagement. These are the ones that I think a lot of companies shy away from because there's no objective, ROI on it. You don't walk away with a certification. You don't know for certain that people learned anything, so it feels higher risk. But peer engagement is things like going to conferences, participating in peer groups, things like that. So let's talk about those a little bit. Um, on the job is probably the most common training MSPs do, right? It has a lot of pros, right? It allows you to train employees on the way you want things done. If I go take a Microsoft certification, it tells me how Microsoft, academically wants me to do stuff. If I take a Cisco exam, it tells me the Cisco way to do things. And a lot of that can be applied to your workspace, but it's not necessarily one for one. It doesn't mean that the person can go take the test and then do their job in your company with your customers. So on the job training helps people learn in a very applicable manner. It has the added benefit of having somebody on staff having to step up and provide training. And I think that's really powerful in itself, right? Stepping up and knowing material well enough that you can then teach somebody else is super critical. I think that's very empowering. And I think it's very good for people to step up and take that. That's part of why I make these videos. It helps me engage and really think through things. So teaching is super useful for learning. It helps build team relationships, right? It gets them out of the day-to-day grind almost of just kind of fighting over technical things or arguing amongst each other about how to do something specifically, and pulls them a little bit further away, a little higher up, and they can talk about things more holistically. So I think it helps build some rapport. I think there's also a good relationship between trainer and trainee, right, when it's done correctly. You'll also see that really bad trainers are people who aren't very good at it or who aren't well practiced and aren't well coached. The opposite will happen, right? You can kind of tear down relationships with bad trainers. So keep an eye on that. It allows for questioning of internal methods, right? As you're teaching something, somebody can ask why. And I think that's really, really powerful, right? As long as you're training internally and you empower new employees or anybody that's being trained to ask why we do something a certain way, and you respond to that by thinking through and answering the question rather than just getting defensive and say, well, it's the way we do it, then you're in a really good position. I really like when new employees start because for like 3 months, you get this, almost unadulterated perspective, right? After about 3 months, they start caving kind of to how things are just the way they are. But But in that first 3 months, if you really give them the ability to speak up and question things, you can really make some progress. So I really enjoy when new hires come on board, and I encourage them to ask why we do stuff if they don't understand it, because often we have overlooked it already, right? Maybe we forgot why we did it a certain way. Maybe our documentation is lax, but everybody kind of knows already, so we don't ever fix it. Take advantage of those new people asking stuff during your internal training. Um, and it's less cash out the door, right? Obviously, that's the big one. You're not paying for someone to teach your employees at some conference or some online course. You are taking more of your company's time, right? Training someone isn't free internally, but it's less cash out the door, and that's good and bad. It just depends on what kind of training you're doing, and sometimes you just can't find someone externally to do the training you need, so you have to do it in house. So definitely, there's some pros for on the job training, and you should utilize that. Now, third party training is where a lot of people will spend some money, especially in the MSP space, right? We'll send people to Microsoft to take Microsoft certifications. A lot of MSPs have programs where they'll pay for the certification test if the person passes. Some have some built in training time on the clock, things like that. But we have to understand that third party training brings a lot of value. Um, it's one of the only ways to introduce new knowledge to your organization, and that's really important, right? Technology changes all the time. If the only way you go about learning is by relying on people going outside of work and doing it on their own, it's not very intentional. You're probably not going to get very far. If you don't have anybody learning anything new, you're going to quickly fall behind on what's available, and you're going to make a lot of mistakes trying to implement new stuff as clients force you to do it. So third party training is a quick way to introduce new knowledge to your organization. Um, it allows for new delivery methods. People learn in different ways, right? Like internally, you may not have time to make a bunch of videos. I like making videos, so I do make internal training videos, but not everybody has time for that. Not everybody has somebody who wants to do that, and not everybody learns from videos. Some people learn from lectures, some people learn from reading books. You can't deliver training internally in every possible way. So third parties often can deliver in different methodologies, and that means people with different learning styles can learn differently, which is really good. They provide networking opportunities, especially if you're doing live sessions, right? One of the cool things that's come around in the last few years is that even for live online trainings, a lot of the providers now have like Discord servers and things like that set up. So even once you're done with the class, you're still kind of connected to these people, and you're connected to a bunch of people who've taken these classes over time. So, I'm on a bunch of Discord channels where there's thousands of people across the country who've taken the same courses as me, and we can maintain these relationships, right? Um, and that's really powerful, being able to rely on a different group, get continuous feedback, see what changes in the training over time. A lot of them have just general networking, Discord channel set up so you can share your LinkedIn. Some of them have job search stuff too, so I mean it's helpful. Maybe not what you want for training an employee, but as an employee it's nice to see that kind of stuff. um, Employees will feel like you're investing in them. I think that's a really important thing. Everybody likes feeling like you're valued. Sending someone to a training is a good way to do that, right? It's saying, hey, we want to invest in you. We trust you. Go do this thing, learn stuff, come back and help us. And that's pretty cool to see. And often these things have objective criteria like a certification at the end of them. So your internal training, some companies have internal certifications, but most of them don't. Third party training, like from Microsoft, from Cisco, from any number of providers, come with a certification at the end. So you have something objective that says the person retained some level of data and was able to take a test to pass that kind of body of knowledge. And for MSPs, it helps with partner relationships. If you're trying to go after different partnership levels with these big vendors, with VMware, with Veeam, with Cisco, with Microsoft, with whoever, you probably have to have multiple people certified in those spaces to get those partnership levels. So there's some business benefit. So third party, lots of different pros there. The cons are they generally cost some money. And the third one is peer engagement. And again, this is the one that I think not enough MSPs really lean into, right? Peer engagement, when I talk about this, is things like conferences. It's things like peer groups. If you're part of ConnectWise, Evolve peer groups, things like that. There's a bunch of different ones out there. I happen to be part of ConnectWise Evolve, so I mentioned that one. But this level of engagement, I think, is kind of next level. Learning from peers just hits different, right? Like you are more likely to listen to a peer generally than you are to your boss. It's just what it is, kind of. Especially if it's not something you necessarily believe in. So throwing a person into a room with their peers where they can generally be a little bit more vulnerable, maybe where it's okay to sort of say you don't really know something. And it's safe to say that without worrying that somebody that you work with every day is going to think you're an idiot. You're generally able to just retain a lot more. There's a bunch of different ways that people can explain it because there's a lot of people in those rooms, right? Um, you're hearing it from people who are in your position specifically, and that's comforting in a lot of ways. Being around a bunch of peers who are all saying, "Hey, we have this problem," makes you feel like maybe you're not an idiot, and that makes you more open to discussing the problem and kind of figuring out solutions. And ultimately, it provides some perspective. I think that's one of the things I've taken away from a lot of these peer interactions over the years is I'm not the only one sort of having the problem. That means that it's solvable. You can talk to people who have solved it before. You can talk to people who haven't solved it or haven't solved problems that you have solved, and maybe gives you the opportunity to teach, and you get that kind of that hit of dopamine for teaching somebody something. But ultimately, it's just a little bit different than reading a book or watching a video. That level of interaction gives you a resource over time to continually go back to for learning. So I think it's really, really helpful. All right. So closing thoughts. Um, Work on your training program consistently, right? Make it an expectation and part of your culture that continuing education is a requirement of the role. You want people wanting to learn, and you want them to know it's expected that they continue to learn. That doesn't mean that they have to go get a new certification every quarter or every year or whatever it is. It just means that they have to tackle something that teaches them something new every year. Um, do it annually. That way you can build it into your budget, right? This stuff isn't free. It requires time off sometimes for taking things like tests or going to classes. There's costs like sending people to training or paying for training resources, paying for certification exams. Things like that all cost money. So start planning as you budget. Set aside a reasonable budget for training, and then work with people to select the training that fits that budget and accomplishes your organization's goals. Um, and make sure you're breaking those training milestones into quarterly goals, just like everything else, right? A lot of times people will say things like, yeah, I want to get my CCNA by the end of the year, and the first 6 months go by and nobody bothered to order a book yet. And then they're like, well, yeah, I ordered the book, and then they don't read it for the next 3 months, and then it's the holidays and that's all falling apart, and it's the end of the year and no one's gotten any training done. Set milestones, acquire training, work through the chapters. If you're working with training partners online, there's a lot of good ones, and a lot of them give you access to what your employees are working on, so you can see their progress through these courses, right? And that's one of the big benefits of sending everybody to the same kind of training companies. You can sort of manage that process and see when they're logging in, how far through their curriculum have they gotten, how well have they done in practice exams, so you can help them with that stuff. It's not about babysitting; it's about accountability, right? So make sure you're building out milestones, because most certifications, I'd say, once you get past like the entry level stuff, isn't going to get done in 90 days. So you have to give people time to do their work, study, and live their lives. So make sure they're reasonable, but track them quarter by quarter, so you know what's going on, when they're studying, what they're working on, and they're working towards that progression of hitting that certification at the end, if that's the goal. All right, so that's the goal. I hope this helps a little bit. If you want any other recommendations on training specifically, I've put out a bunch of videos on that subject about different kinds of certifications and reviews. Feel free to check that out. But other than that, have a great night.